guys, I'm excited to have Matthias back on the channel. We actually had a really popular live stream when he was demoing the Power BI tools here last month, and a lot of people were asking for kind of a more detailed walkthrough of the deployment process with the tool into Azure DevOps and also to the GitHub environment. So what we're going to do is have a kind of a three-part tutorial series for this, where this first video that we're doing now is going to walk through the basic setup of the actual environment itself for Power BI tools, and then we'll have two videos, each dedicated specifically to either deployment in Azure DevOps for the toolset or to GitHub. And those will be two following videos as well, lower down in this playlist. But to start with, Matthias, could you want to give a little background about yourself and the tool that we're going to be walking through today?
Absolutely. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me back as well. Really appreciate it, Reed. I'm author of PBI-Tools, which you hopefully have heard about. This is bringing source control capabilities to Power BI and to PBX files in particular. And this is also bringing DevOps automation capabilities to Power BI, which is what we want to show today as a step-by-step tutorial.
Exactly, yeah, and I think that's this is going to be really helpful for a lot of people getting started with it for sure, and wanting to do a good thorough walkthrough of it. Additionally, on top of these videos, we will have a supplementary video, which will be some common pain points in terms of some headaches you might come through deployment. So also stay tuned for that as well. But otherwise, are you ready to get started?
Absolutely.
All right, let me go flip over for us. There we go.
Okay, very good. So this is the PBI.tools website, basically the home for PBI tools. Here you find the latest releases. You can download them. And there's also a getting started tutorial following the behind the green button here. In terms of what we want to cover today, let me show you the setup. I have a Power BI Workspace here. It currently doesn't have anything in it. What we want to achieve by the end of the tutorial is to have a report, a thin report, deployed into this workspace using an automated deployment pipeline. The report will be connected to a data set that's already in that tenant. In fact, I've got the report open in Power BI Desktop. That's what it looks like. And we can see down here, it's got a live connection to the data set called introducing calculation groups, which sits in the datasets workspace. Let me get started in what I would do on my local machine in terms of setting up a repository, installing PBI-Tools in a repository, then actually pushing the repository into GitHub as well as Azure DevOps, and then wiring up the actual deployment logic in those two systems. So this report, which is open, I actually have set up in an empty folder already. It's called GitHub Actions, I'm gonna git enable this folder to start with. So I'm gonna open a terminal, and I'm going to say git init. That one doesn't change very much, other than you can see that this is now showing up as green. The VS Code Git integration is actually kicking in, and VS Code knows that I now have a change in my folder. The other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to actually keep the PBIX file in source control rather than the extracted PBIX sources, which is another capability PBI-Tools has. But for now, let's just assume we're not ready to make that move in actually using PBI-Tools, which obviously uses some experimental features. Let's say we're not ready and we just want to use the deployment capabilities in PBI-Tools with our existing PBIX files. In order to support that better, I'm going to use Git LFS. LFS is a Git add-on, which stands for Large File Support, and that allows me to use Git in conjunction with chunky binary files, and PBIX files are an example of that. Git LFS is usually available whenever you've got Git installed. It's very common nowadays, and it's generally available as standard installations. What I need to do as a one-off, I need to do Git LFS install to basically enable for this current working folder. So Git LFS install is not a machine-wide installation. It's an installation just for this repo. If you create another one later, you're still going to have to do Git LFS install once. And then I'm going to say Git LFS track, and I'm going to say track all files with a PBIX file extension using LFS, which basically means when I push those up into GitHub or Azure DevOps, those files will actually be stored in blob storage as opposed to the native Git file system. And we can see it's confirmed that it's tracking PBIX files. In fact, there's also an additional metadata file now, .git attributes. When we look into that, it basically says PBIX files use LFS for Git operations. So that's my setup in terms of having Git enabled. Next thing I need to do is to set up my Power BI environment. So I need to be able to deploy into the workspace I talked about earlier. I'm going to be using a service principal for that, which is the preferred and most secure way of actually authenticating to Power BI. If we look here, this is my admin view. In order to enable the use of service principals in Power BI, your administrator or whoever has access to Power BI admin portal needs to make one change initially, which is under tenant settings. You need to allow service principals to use Power BI APIs. That can either be enabled for the entire organization, which is not recommended, or it can be enabled for specific security groups. So I've done that. I've created a security group, Power BI DevOps Principles. And that's already in place and configured. If I switch over to the Azure portal in the same tenant, looking at the security group, we can see there's one member in here, which is the reports DevOps principle. So that's a security principle I've already set up. It's ready to be used. And looking at that on the next tab, we can see reports DevOps principle. And I've got my client ID, which is this one, D3AB, which you're going to have to grab and make available in our local setup. So we'll see that in a bit. So this is all set up. I prepared this before the recording because there's normally a bit of a delay between security principles being set up and then becoming effective. So if I now go into my Power BI Workspace, I need to make sure that that same security principle actually has access to my workspace. And we can see here, if I hover over this little I symbol, it shows me reports DevOps principle. And we also have the app ID here, D3AB. We looked at that in a bit. So this is set up in this case as an admin. It would actually be sufficient if it were just a contributor or a member. So either of those security levels would be sufficient for deployment. Viewer obviously is not sufficient. And then the other point, which is something which you can very easily stumble across and get a problem with is because we're talking about live connection reports with a data set sitting in a different workspace, you need to make sure that the service principal we're using for deployment actually has access to the data set. And the data set I'm using is this one. And if I go to manage permissions, I've given the reports DevOps principal, service principal contributor access. So that's all good. And contributor is, sorry, I haven't given that one contributor access. So that's actually the point I was trying to make. So what you cannot do, you cannot go in here and add user and then find the reports DevOps principle. Basically, security principles are not supported for granting direct access to a data set. That's the point I was trying to make. So what I had to do instead is to actually give that service principal workspace level permissions, which is why this is showing up as contributor. Contributor is a workspace permission. That's not a dataset permission. And that's necessary in order to get around that limitation. So basically, this workspace datasets has my same service principal as a contributor. And this is really important because otherwise we'll not be able to publish a report with a connection to that same data set. So with all of that in place, we have what is needed in terms of setup, permissions, security. So we can continue with our local setup. So I'm going back to VS Code now, where I've got my Git enabled, where I've got my report. And what I'm going to start with is I'm going to put a deployment manifest in here. So this is a standard file which PBI-Tools requires. It's the .pbix.proj.json file name. And I'm just going to paste in something I've already prepared. So this fits nicely on one screen, and that basically is our deployment manifest. So let's have a look through this. What do we do here? We define deployments. We give a name to one specific deployment manifest. In this case, it's just called files. And then we say the deployment mode is report. So basically, we're deploying PBX files. The source for it is file, file being we're referencing a PBX file, as opposed to folder, which would be an extracted file format. And then we're coming back to our service principal, and which is why I read out the GUID earlier, D3AB. So this is something which should be familiar now. I also need to specify the tenant ID in conjunction with my client ID. The service principal also has a secret, which is effectively like a password. I'm not going to specify the secret in my manifest because that would be readable to anyone with access to the repository. Instead, I'm going to make it available as an environment variable. So this is the syntax, which basically says, grab the secret from the environment variable called PBI_client_secret. And then this setting says when a report is being published and it already exists, override it, otherwise create one from scratch. So this is what I would always recommend as the default setting for imports. And down here, we can specify multiple environments. So you can actually get to a fairly sophisticated setup with dev, test, and prod environments, for instance. for this tutorial today, I'm going to keep it very simple. We're just going to have one single environment where we're specifying the workspace reports DevOps tutorial. This manifest is ultimately going to be executed by PBI-Tools, and it will look at this path expression, and we'll find all matching PBIX files. In this case, there's just the one here, and we'll then publish any of those files into the workspace. Now, one thing we can do is to actually run this whole process on our client, on the client side. We are not limited to basically developing something here in theory and then pushing it either into GitHub or Azure. We can test this end to end, making sure that we haven't got any typos anywhere, making sure we've got our service principles set up correctly. So I'm going to switch to another shell, this one here. And this one basically has the secret for my service principal in the local setting. So that's why I'm switching to a different shell here. Otherwise, I'm looking at exactly the same folder. So if I do there, I can see we've got 3 files now. I also have PBI-Tools on my path, which means I can open it and reference it without specifying where it actually lives. And I can now go and test my local setup by saying PBI-Tools deploy. Whenever I specify a particular action without actually putting all the required arguments in place, PBI-Tools will automatically give me the built-in documentation. So this is something to keep in mind. I oftentimes can't even remember, every single argument or exactly what they're spelled. So I always start like that. Basically, have the tool remind me how it works. And what I need to do here is PBI-Tools deploy. Then I specify the folder which contains my manifest. Because it's the same folder I'm already in, I can keep it as simple, just putting a dot there. Then I'm specifying a label, which is basically what I've got in line 5 here. This is my manifest label. So in this case, it would be files. And the final argument would be the environment I want to deploy into. Because I've only specified one environment in line 23 called prod, I'm going to have to specify prod. And because I'm not entirely sure whether I've done everything right or not, I can do what if, which basically simulates the deployment without actually deploying it. So if I run this, there we go. What has it done? It's read the deployment manifest from here. It then reminds me that the what if mode is enabled. It specifies we're using the files manifest to go into the prod environment. And then it's looking for matching files for my source expression. In fact, it's found one, which is expected because we've got just one file here. It also verifies my credentials. So that's super helpful. Credentials is probably one area where you're likely to have some misconfiguration. So this is all being tested here. And then it basically says that's the report I will be deploying into this particular workspace. So if I now rerun this same command without the what if flag, it will perform the deployment. There we go. So now it's actually taken this PBIX file, put it up into my workspace. If I go back and switch to reports DevOps tutorial, I can see I didn't have anything in here previously. Now I've got report 2, and it also happens to be linked to a data set in another workspace. If I open a report, we'll see this is exactly what I had open in Power BI Desktop. So that basically concludes the first part in terms of the setup, both in Power BI as well as in my local repository. In the next part of the tutorial, we're then going to go into GitHub, create a GitHub repository, and create a pipeline within GitLab.
Exactly, and for the people watching, you'll depending on which environment you want to deploy on, you'll check the playlist and look for either the video to go to the next video, either to GitHub or to Azure, depending on where your environment will reside. But otherwise, Matthias, thanks for this walkthrough. This has been great, and all of you, I'll see you in the next video.
Fantastic, thanks.
Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment, or share this video. Plus, if you have any comments for a future video, go ahead and add that to the comment section down below. Now, if this is your first time to my channel, or you want to see more of these awesome videos, please click that subscribe and notification button. Also, feel free to show your support by becoming a channel member.